Hello, I think we're ready to start. So welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cheryl Lloyd and I'm a programme head here at the Nuffield Foundation and will be chairing today. I'm really delighted that you can join us to hear findings from new research published today and from our great lineup of speakers to discuss why the English system must do better to support young people's post-16 transitions in education and how this can be achieved. A couple of housekeeping points before we start. So I should explain that attendees will not be visible or audible during the webinar. After the presentation and panel responses, there will be time for discussion and answering your questions. So if you would like to ask a question to the speakers, please do so by typing in the Q&A box. If your question is directed to a particular speaker, please also highlight this in your question. We have closed captions in English, which you can access by clicking on the CC icon on the screen near the Q&A button. And then finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event, as will the slides from the presentation. Now, turning to the format today, we have a presentation from Professor Ruth Lupton, Honorary Professor at the University of Manchester. Following Ruth's presentation, panellists will respond to the findings, after which we'll be opening up the session to questions and comments from the audience. As I said earlier, you can address comments and questions to any of our presenters or panellists and submit these or queries of clarification at any point, so please do put these in as you think of them. Before the presentation, I want to say a few things about why at the Nuffield Foundation we have been supporting the project. And I think that the findings are important. So being awarded a specific grade, whether it's C or now a 4 or above in English and Maths GCSE, has been a minimum requirement for access to more advanced study and training courses for over 20 years now. Students who do not gain these grades at age 16, so-called low attainers, often face more limited opportunities for further education and training, leaving them at higher risk of economic disadvantage as they enter adulthood and beyond. There's been a real lot of concern about this group over time, but actually fairly little is known about their motivations, their pathways, and their achievements during the 16 to 19 phase, and actually who they are. The research team have been examining this in detail, considering both maths and English, which are often considered quite separately, to provide a much more in-depth understanding of young people's experiences, the national picture across England, and how these issues play out at a local level, to give us a much richer insight than we've had before. Crucially, this also provides recommendations for how policy and other groups can better to support young people to achieve their aims and realise their potential. So without further delay, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Ruth Lupton. Ruth is Honorary Professor at the University of Manchester and has led the project. So I'm going to pass over to Ruth now.
Okay, thank you very much, Cheryl, and thank you everybody for coming today and for your interest in this research. I'm very sorry you can't see me this morning. There's been a late problem with my webcam, but I am here and hopefully you can hear me okay. So I'm going to put my slides up now, and if Cheryl, if you could let me know when they're there, that would be great.
Yeah, we can see them now. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So I'm going to do the presentation, but my colleagues from the research team, Stephanie Thompson, Sanna Veltus and Lorna Unwin, are all here, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to contribute to the questions and discussions later. As Cheryl said, our motivation for doing this research was to understand more about a large group of young people, around 40% in most years, who are of increasing concern, but about whom relatively little is known, and that is young people whose GCSE attainment is below the thresholds that sought the English system at 16. Most of the policy and research focus to date has been on getting more people to these thresholds and on progression to higher attainment, higher academic or technical education. And notably, even the recent FE White Paper has very little to say on progression below level 3, even though for multiple reasons a focus on wider achievement seems particularly imperative at the current time. So what our research does is focus on what we've called lower attainers, that is to say young people who don't have a GCSE grade 9 to 4, formerly A star to C, in English and or maths, and we look at those separately. but we describe them by what they have achieved, not by the fact that they haven't achieved the threshold, and thus we illuminate the variation within that group. And the research links the pre-16 and the post-16 phases by identifying groups of learners with different achievements at the end of Key Stage 4 in the National Pupil Database, and then following their different trajectories in the post-16 phase. A particular contribution that we make, I think, is that we report on an unpacked geographical variation, and we report a lot of our results at region, city region, and sometimes local authority level, but I'm not going to be talking a great deal about that today just for reasons of time. So a little bit more about our methodology. So our quantitative analysis looked at 5 GCSE cohorts, 2013 to 2017, but with a particular focus on the 2015 cohort, which at the time of doing the research was the last cohort that we could look at right through to age 19. We do look at change over time, both between 2013 and 15 to look at the impact of the so-called Wolf reforms, and also 2015 to 17, but I'm not going to talk about that analysis today. We conducted 7 locality case studies, 4 of them in Greater Manchester and 4 of them in the north of Tyne city region. And in these localities, we profiled the post-16 provision. And then we went on to create what we called opportunity sets, which was to log the actual courses and apprenticeships available within 60-minute travel time for young people living in these localities. And these courses and apprenticeship opportunities were analysed by their entry requirements to determine which opportunities were available to which learners. And this unusually detailed and the team will say laborious work was carried out mainly in 2019, which we probably now think of as our last normal year. The qualitative research comprised focus groups involving altogether 47 so-called low retainers. And in these groups, we did a number of activities, including the young people drawing maps of the post-16 provision they were aware of in their area and then talking about those, and also giving advice and information to hypothetical friends, young people we had made up with different combinations of GCSE and equivalent results and with different interests. And here are some of the hypothetical friends that are used in the focus group. We then went on to interview 12 of the young people who attended the focus groups. And these discussions mainly focused on the young people's own journeys and decisions, including using a timeline device to talk through what they'd thought about doing, who had advised them, what options they considered, what was available, how they'd found out about things and so on. And there's one of the examples of the timelines. And finally, we conducted a number of exploratory interviews with professionals in the localities to help us understand the landscape and the issues. And we were advised by local advisory panels, and also, I ought to say, by a national advisory panel with very wide-ranging post-16 expertise. So it was a very, very large piece of work, but as always, there is a lot more that we could have done and perhaps wished we had done. And so we really hope that this work will serve as a springboard for future work. So now to the findings then, and I'm going to start with the transition from Key Stage 4 and how that's experienced by young people with lower attainment. It probably goes without saying that the landscape of provision is much more complicated for lower attainers than it is for people who are going on to A-levels or level 3 technical qualifications. There are more levels, there are many more options, there are more providers, and far more young people of this kind will move institution. So you can see here that only 18% of lower attainers in the 2015 cohort went on into a school sixth form. The provision is perhaps more predictable, less predictable year on year. Apprenticeships are theoretically an option, but as we know, in short supply for 16 to 18-year-olds and competitive to get. Our qualitative research and the locality case studies really revealed that the entry requirements vary for similar courses and apprenticeships, adding to the complexity and the transparency of what was available. But they do often specify both English and Maths GCSE at grade 4 and above. So much of the level 3 provision was inaccessible to all of the lower attainers that we looked at. And this graph here just shows that for the 7 locality areas with the orange dashed bars showing the proportion of the level 3 opportunities that were inaccessible to any of the young people that we were looking at. You can see there substantial variation, but nevertheless a significant proportion of all of the opportunities in every area. The key takeaway from our qualitative work was that these complicated and non-transparent decisions were also being made in a highly pressurized environment in year 11, where young people were concentrating on their GCSEs and stressed about their GCSEs. And many of the young people we talked to conveyed a sense of their own failure and a lack of confidence in their future. So here was, and they said they needed more time to make decisions, both during year 10 and 11, but also you know, in the summer of and thereafter. And here's Bob, for example. Bob was determined to go into the fire service and had been doing a lot of voluntary work with the local cadets, but he had to put that aside in year 11 because the exams were so stressful and time consuming. And year 11 he found a particularly stressful and confidence destroying year, and then suddenly got to the end of it and hadn't made any you know, future plans about college or anything else. Hazel, on the other hand, talked about constant pressure to make a decision, to the point where it felt like you just had to plump for something, just had to rush and pick something, get on any course rather than no course. And many of the people we spoke to articulated the need for more support, but also an approach to advice and guidance that focused on what they could achieve, not just on their academic failures. And this was Saskia's account of her careers advice, which she found particularly unhelpful. I think that would be an understatement. And Saskia's went on to give this assessment of the careers advice and guidance in her school, a sentiment that was echoed by many of the young people that we spoke to. It's really important to note that these experiences of transition are experienced by young people who are coming into that with very different levels of achievement. And this is, I think, one of the important contributions and structuring devices of the research project. We divided the group of lower attainers, that 40%, into 9 separate groups. On the left here, you've got those who had 5 GCSEs or equivalent to A star to C, some with maths, some with English, and some with neither. And then we had 3 groups who had some A stars to C, but not 5. And some of those had a higher grade in maths or English, and some didn't. And that was the largest group, some A to C with neither. And then there were young people who did not have any GCSE or equivalent passes at grades A star to C. Altogether, 43% of the young lower attainer cohort had English or maths at A star to C, or maths, English or maths, and 21% had 5 A star to C. So not at all a group that was leaving school with nothing or without the basics. And in fact, these young people that I was just talking about typically had 8 GCSE passes, as well as some vocational qualifications. And even these young people typically had at least 5 GCSE passes. Nevertheless, there is a minority in this group that has very low attainment. Around 17% of the lower attainer group, which equates to about 7% of the whole cohort, had no GCSE passes, or fewer than 5 passes at any grade. In other words, they were below what's often regarded as a good level of general education, below full level 1. We had a look at what these young people were doing, and I think it's fair to say that some of them were experiencing a very limited Key Stage 4 curriculum, and that's just an example of one of the profiles that we did. But they also, I think, many of them face significant disadvantage. This graph here just shows free school meal and SEN status, as it were, for each of the 9 groups, and I've just highlighted the 2 lower attaining groups at that side there, and you can see that about 20% had SEN, but sorry, free school meals and special educational needs. Large proportion had special educational needs, no free school meals. Some had free school meals and no SEN, and only a small proportion of both these groups had neither special education need or were eligible for free school meals. You can also see here the large proportion of these groups for whom their special education needs status was not recorded, which suggests perhaps interrupted schooling or new arrivals. So while I don't want to focus the whole of this presentation on this group, I think this lower attaining group is a group, which is clearly of considerable concern, and the need for more support for young people like this came up a lot in our conversations with professionals. From these starting points, many low attainers do make a lot of progress between age 16 and 19. So we can see here that 75% of the lower attaining group achieved at least 1 level 2 qualification between age 16 and 19, and 2/5 of them achieved at least 1 level 3 qualification. But nevertheless, that's a significant minority who are not achieving a level 2 qualification, at least in the 3-year period between 16 and 19. And as you'd expect, there's an enormous amount of variety depending on their prior attainment. So this graph here shows the percentage achieving level 2 or level 3 qualification at least between age 16 and age 18. That's 18 is the solid bars, and 19 is the dotted lines for the first 7 groups in our classification. Things to note here are that the groups with 5 A star to C, whether or not they had English and maths, a large proportion of those achieved a level 3 qualification in the post-16 phase, but that drops off very sharply for those who had lower GCSE attainment, regardless of English and maths. And the other interesting thing here to note is, especially for the lower attainers at the right of the graph, that quite a lot of people made up ground between 18 and 19. So a surprising number of people are staying in the post-16 phase for 3 years. I'm not going to dwell on this graph, but that's the same graph for the bottom two attaining groups that I highlighted earlier. And you can see that the proportions achieving a level 2 qualification are substantially lower, and also significant minority not achieving a level 1 qualification between age 16 and 19. So what does our research tell us about what happens in between? First, progression after Key Stage 4. Just quickly to point out that further education college is the majority destination for this group. That's the light blue at the bottom here, again showed by achievement group, and particularly so for those at the lower end of the achievement spectrum. So that's really just to emphasize that if we want to improve the prospects of these young people, the FE college sector is hugely important. Apprenticeships are shown here in blue at the top. Apprenticeship was only slightly more, a slightly higher destination for lower attainers than it was for the group as a whole. And we also found that going into an apprenticeship was markedly less common for those who were eligible for free school meals and those who were not. I haven't shown the two lower groups on this slide, but their destinations after Key Stage 4 were very different. There were very high levels of what's known as NEET, nearly a third in the lowest attaining group, and also a wider variety of provision, because some of these young people went into special school sixth forms. A particularly interesting finding was the level of learning that young people started at. Overall, a quarter of the lower attaining group started year 12 at level 1 or below, and considerable proportions started at lower levels than their existing achievement. So these young people, ringed in red, already had full level 2 going into year 12, but many of them started at level 2 and some of them at level 1. And this next group of young people, highlighted in the purple, already have some level 2 qualifications, but many of them started at level 1, and many of them at level 2, and a significant minorities at level 1. I think it's really important to say that this isn't necessarily a problem, and it was particularly common and important in some occupational areas, including, for example, construction, where there's a whole new repertoire of skills to be learned. But the qualitative research suggested that it's also partly because of those difficult and unprepared transitions for some young people. So people working out what they wanted to do, settling down, finding their feet, and in some cases getting onto a course rather than no course. And for some young people, it was a combination of that and the fact that the work that they were needing to do in English and maths was extremely time consuming and difficult to program with another a large qualification. And some of the young people that we spoke to did feel that who were on level 1 did feel that their time was being wasted a bit and they weren't moving on as quickly as they might. It's possibly stating the obvious that where you start matters for where you end up, but here is the obvious. This graph just shows that larger group, the largest group, the sum A star to C with neither English or maths category, and at the bottom the bars show the main level of learning at the start of year 12, and the sections of the bars show the highest level of qualification achieved by age 18. So 3/4 of people who started on level 3 in this group achieved a level 3 qualification, and indeed so did around a quarter who started on level 2, but most of those, their highest level of qualification was level 2. And for those who started on level 1, half achieved a level 2 qualification, but very few got further than that. And these were people within the same broad attainment category who started at different levels. So it's just really important to, I suppose, emphasising the importance of getting those initial transitions right. And finally, just to touch on local variation and destination starting points and outcomes. We already saw that big local variation in the availability of level 3 provision, which we said was due to a combination of provision structure and practice. I see I'm running slightly out of time, so I just put this up to highlight, you know, perhaps surprising differences in the level of in the post-16 systems of different places. These are year 12 destinations, again for people in the same sorts of attainment categories. If you have 5 A to C with English in London, about 31% would go to an FE college, compared with over half in Newcastle City Region or Greater Manchester. Going to a sixth form college, much more prominent than in London. This makes a difference to what people do. So in some of our localities with higher proportions of places in school sixth forms, for example, at the North of Tyne ones, more of the level 3 opportunities are academic and therefore more accessible to lower attainers than BQs or apprenticeships. And we found that differences between areas in what was achieved in the 16 to 19 phase were mainly explained by these different in starting levels, as well as obviously by the prior attainment of the young people. In other words, there weren't systematic differences in the quality of provision. Okay, so where did we conclude from all of that? Two big things, probably. The first thing is that we think our findings challenge the assumption that it's purely the young people's lack of attainment in English maths that is holding them back. It's also the lack of the coordinated and accessible opportunities for them to develop and progress, and including the need for more time and support for young people who are having to make the most complicated decisions at the youngest age from the least advantage starting points in the system. So we argued that really we need a major policy shift away from a narrow focus on English and maths, although these are important, and towards progression for all. And some of the things we recommended, many of you will see in this sort of recommendation before, you know, many times over the last 20 years, to have an integrated upper secondary phase lasting 3 years. We suggest the need for extended transition programs beyond just the T levels, for additional funded support for the lowest attaining learners, and importantly for changes in curriculum and accountability measures in Key Stage 4 to recognise wider learning and build towards post-16. I've paused. Why have I paused? Resume. Okay. Sorry. Just when we get into the punchline. And finally, we come to this point of significant local variation structures and practices, some of which is desirable, right, because of different local labour markets and pre-16 provision. But there's, despite the large local variation, there's very little capacity for local coordination. So we argue that government needs to increase the capacity and funding of local areas to analyse their local situation like we did, to construct appropriate post-16 progression routes that link with other services and local labour market needs, to deal with some of these issues about entry requirements, to establish effective and equitable careers provision, and also to provide contingency and stimulus funding to fill gaps and deal with some of the year-on-year unpredictability. The white paper, those of you who are familiar with it, does enable some of this local coordination, but between employers and colleges, and there's no role for the local state articulated there, which we think is a mistake. So that's a very quick run through of a very enormous project. Thank you for listening. I hope it's going to stimulate a good discussion, and I'll now hand back to Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that overview. I would say we've had a couple of questions in so far, but do put in any other questions you've got of clarification, you want to find out a bit more, or for Ruth, the wider team, and all our other speakers. So now I'm very pleased to move into our panel responses. We've asked each to speak for up to 5 minutes. So I'm going to say up front, please don't be offended if I hurry any of you along. First up, we have Professor Andy Noyes from the University of Nottingham. Andy has recently led a Nuffield Foundation project investigating maths in further education colleges in England. So he's very well placed to provide additional insight into some of the issues Ruth raises and kind of talk more broadly about maths in FE. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Sharon. First of all, congratulations to Ruth and the team on completing your project in such challenging times and for surviving the trial of working with administrative data in an increasingly risk-averse landscape. And I certainly know what that feels like over the last few years. So yes, I wanted to make some comments about the Nuffield-funded Maths in Further Education Colleges project. So having sort of listened a little bit to the positioning of mathematics in the previous presentation, we started from the assumption that quantitative skills are important. They're important for individuals and for society, whether you consider that economically or in terms of citizenship, health choices, financial literacy, and as we've heard recently, ability to sift fake news, things like that are all related to sort of mathematical confidence and competence. But just to say that, making that assumption of the importance of all those things, not necessarily to support the current state of things as they're happening in FE, for example, the policy of bolting on GCSE resets to vocational programmes. So the MyFEC project was similarly concerned with who gets what, where and how, and we were focusing much more on institutional level and in particular large general FE colleges. The project was mixed methods as Ruth's project and multi-scale in that we wanted to really understand how national patterns worked in classrooms and everywhere in between, kind of a systems and complexity approach. We had 31 colleges, case study colleges, a national teacher survey, and we were undertaking quite a bit of secondary data analysis as well. And the timing of the work enabled us to explore the enactment of the Wolf reforms, as they were referred to previously, or the condition of funding that came in 2014 and 15 has had quite a considerable impact on some of the things we've just been hearing about and how what gets prioritised and and the sort of processes in the FE colleges around mathematics and English. We're interested in how places and organisational processes and people and practices all work together to produce different learning opportunities. And in particular for similar learners in geographically distant colleges, and whether understanding some of that can help us to develop better or more consistent educational opportunities. And I think for me, one of the striking things, as you know, somebody with a background in secondary schools and school teaching, the considerable institutional heterogeneity in the FE sector and in general FE colleges. Scale of the colleges, the number of sites, the structural arrangements, the staffing, the curriculum, educational values, organisational culture, and so on. And all of these have got really important implications for systemic change. We mustn't forget that. So in light of all of those variations, colleges respond to the condition of funding and the pressures that creates in quite different ways. So to give one example from our work, if you imagine all those students entering into the FE sector with a grade E as it was, or a 2 now, what should they experience in terms of mathematics pathways? Well, in some places, the policy levers of progress measures, maximising progress for individuals, pushed colleges to full re-entry into GCSE maths. I mean, maybe 10% of those students progress from a grade E, even more go backwards or stay the same and create quite a lot of negative, unhelpful negative feeling about mathematics. Another college might say, well, we want to maximise the number of students getting a grade C or 4. So we'll minimise the number of grade 2 students going in so we can maximise that. And then others have got a different approach where they take individual decisions, individual need. So when it comes to curriculum organisation, some colleges are dispersing their mathematics, some are centralising it, some have got large organised teams, and some have got sort of very embedded teams in vocational areas. And all of these, there's sort of little consensus on how you approach these problems, constant change, and no time to properly understand and evaluate local interventions. And in all of this busyness distracts us from a critical question, or critical question that I've got is, what mathematics and how should it be done? And in all of that, we report what's called the academic drift in skills qualifications through core skills and key skills and functional skills, the sort of perpetual reinvention of these things. Ruth mentioned repeated messages over 20 years, and we see the same things in these areas. What's actually happened in the condition of funding has pushed us towards an isolated, bolted-on maths curriculum, which is some way from what we think we need. And whether or not any of that is building the quantitative skills base, which I think is important, is a moot point. So, recognising considerable support for the sort of maths for all to 18 agenda, we concluded that post-16 maths learning needs a serious rethink to be more relevant to the needs of vocational learners. And whatever happens, we need to recognise that the sort of local institutional context and complexity has a major impact upon that. And I'm going to stop there. 10 seconds over my 5-minute chart.
Thanks very much, Andy. That's really helpful to hear. So now I'm going to move on to Professor Ruth Keep, who is Emeritus Chair in Education, Training and Skills at the Department for Education at University of Oxford. Ruth was one of the founders and a director of the Centre on Skills, Knowledge and Organisational Performance at Oxford, and has published on many relevant areas to today's discussion with apprenticeships, qualifications reform, skills policy formation, just to name a few. So really interested to hear what you think.
Thanks very much. Well, can I congratulate the research team on this piece of work? I think it's really important because it makes visible a really substantial group of students who are often either in the background or sort of out of focus when national policymakers talk about, you know, the panorama of sort of 16 to 19 provision. And I think we need to think very hard about this group of students. The research picks up and echoes a number of concerns that I recall were worrying the Nuffield 14 to 19 review back in the early 2000s. And it does seem to me that there is an overarching issue in that we have this in England, a long-standing obsession with sorting young people into the virtuous and the less virtuous, the sheeps and the goats. And that problem has worsened over time with the arrival of 50% participation in higher education. The top half, as I think policymakers often think of the students who do the A-level route, the royal route, they're heading for higher education, and everyone who isn't doing that is the bottom half on a set of less than royal routes. So I think the more that you have decided to make expanding higher education the answer to every education and skills problem, the more likely it is that those not heading towards higher education are designated as relative failures. I think the research is very useful in showing up the vacuum where apprenticeships for 16 to 19-year-olds ought to be, but aren't. And I think that's a really large problem that policy at the moment isn't confronting or tackling. I think another thing that comes out for me, and it's not particularly surprising, is that given the relative complexity of the non-A-level, non-higher education routes, decisions that have been made in the recent past around careers information, advice and guidance appear extremely unhelpful. We really need high quality support around careers and course choice, and work by people like Anthony Mann and others at the Education Employers Task Force and now the OECD have shown that young people's perceptions of potential career opportunities are often wildly at variance with the reality of what's on offer in the local labour market. So I think we are going to have to think much harder around careers information, advice and guidance. Location matters. Yes, I think it really does. And some of you will remember Anne Hodgson and Ken Spore's 2013 study of a local low skill, low participation equilibrium in an East Coast town. There are lots of places where the state and structure of the local labour market limits opportunities for training and for employment for those not leaving higher education. And I think that insofar as we have an agenda around levelling up is easy to say, but as we're going to discover, it's very hard to do given the state of some local economies and labour markets. And I think that really limits choices for a lot of young people. I guess the final point I'd make is the one about, again, the labour market, that it's not just that there are problems inside the education system, and I think the project's really good at showing what those problems are, but those students, even when they've achieved whatever they're going to achieve, are then faced by a labour market that is really pretty tough on young people. The Institute of Employment's Research's Precarious Pathways project showed very clearly, once students leave education, the pathways into stable employment are now as complex and uncompromisingly difficult as the pathways inside vocational education. Employers want experience, and they increasingly select through various forms of work trial. 0 hours, contracts, agency work, temporary contracts, internships. And the more vulnerable students find this, and youngsters find this very hard pathway to navigate. And when you get what some researchers have called pinball transitions, unhelpfully dotted with pitfalls and dead ends, we're going to have to think about what we do for young people. And again, it comes back to not just careers information, advice and guidance, but the support we offer young people to make transitions, both in education, but also when they enter the labour market. So I think this has done a splendid job in showing some of the problems and pointing the way towards some of the things we could try and do to help this very large group of young people who we really need to offer a better start in educational and working life than we currently do. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. I suspect we might come on back to some of those issues in the discussion later. Next, I'm really pleased to introduce Catherine Sezon, who is the Senior Policy Manager for FE at the Association of Colleges. Catherine also previously worked in further education as a teacher and manager, so I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts about the report and findings are, Catherine.
Hello everyone, thanks very much, Cheryl. So for me, I was so delighted to see this research. Having worked in colleges for many years, I recognise the story that it tells. 90% of 16 to 18-year-olds who are retaking GCSEs in English and Maths are doing so in further education colleges. And further education colleges are helping those young people progress to higher levels. As the research points out, and as Ewa has just referred to, there is very little data in this area. And again, that for me was very encouraging to see how this has been put out. It's so helpful to get an overview of the landscape, the progression opportunities, the transition, and very timely, as the Department for Education is currently calling for evidence of qualifications and practice at level 2 and below. And because I believe that it's in this space that we can have the most impact in terms of improving progression and life opportunities for all young people. There are so many good recommendations that it's difficult to know exactly where to start. So looking at the fully funded 3-year phase, the importance of data collection, apprenticeships eligible within the social security system, although of course employers would need to agree to take on 16-year-olds. And I think sometimes they perhaps feel they're not ready, but actually in my experience, lots of young people, they're very motivated and excited about that opportunity to get into the workspace. But in the 3 minutes that I've got, I thought I would draw on the following points based on making progression count for every individual student. So the key points that jumped out at me are about post-16 destinations. Lowest attainers are more likely to move provider and go to a further education college. This has lots of implications in terms of travel to learn patterns for these lower attainers, but also the information that accompanies them. It's often scant unless they have an education, health and care plan. In order to better support these young people, and so they don't have to keep telling their story again and again and again, there should be an agreed system for transfer of supporting this vital information. Key stage 4 provision. So obviously we're looking here at transitions post-16, but actually we can't forget what happens before. And there needs to be more pre and post-16 links. Planning needs time and a range of information, advice and guidance. It should start at the beginning of Key Stage 4, if not before, combined with the recognition that young people change their minds. College-based Key Stage 4 programmes, such as those of you on the call might remember, increased flexibility and the young apprenticeship programmes, things that I was very much involved with when I worked in college. They were courses run in the early 2000s, and they were very successful in supporting students to achieve level 1 or level 2 vocational qualifications, and then progress to level 2 or 3 at 16. But perhaps even more importantly, they also supported that vital transition journey to college. College wasn't new at 16. Staff knew the students, they knew their strengths, they knew their areas for development. And of course, all this needs resource, funding and time. The opportunity to deal with the barriers to progression, which may be to do with self-esteem and self-confidence, disrupted education. There are a variety of reasons why young people are not successful at 16, and yet they can go on, and every college will tell you of amazing stories of young people who started at lower levels and have progressed to level 3, level 4, level 5, and have gone on to get successful degrees and successful careers. And it's such a worthwhile investment because of the impact on those NEET figures. So even in a hard-nosed way, economic way, it is really important for the country. You invest now to save in the future. Finally, I couldn't talk this morning without talking about English and maths. English and maths are absolutely crucial skills, whether that be for work or indeed for life in general. But the current condition of funding is set up to appear quite punitive. You didn't achieve at 16, so you need to do more of the same. We also have, of course, the new landscape with T-levels. And for a T-level, you need to have achieved English and maths at level 2 in order to get the full T-level. So my argument would be that we need to be more innovative. We need to make it more relevant. We have great staff doing amazing jobs teaching English and maths up and down the country. But it's really difficult when you're going back over things that weren't engaging to young people when they were in school. So we've had 6 years of the condition of funding. It's time for a review to get people around the table, most importantly, to support our young people into work, but into life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I'm now pleased to pass over to Alan Francis, who has been Principal and Chief Executive of Oldham College since 2010. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much. Can I first of all echo the congratulations that all of the other speakers have extended to the research team for a fantastic piece of research that really zooms in on the forgotten 50% that we're all talking about but know very little about. Policy is talking about them a lot. Lots of people have got lots to say about them, but actually there's not a lot known about them. And I'm particularly proud that one of the researchers is a governor at Oldham College, a very good governor, I would add. Why I mention that is I think it's exceptionally important that research like this helps to bring together the practicality of the coalface with the need to step back and think about things differently. And we've got to find better ways sometimes of sharing kind of intellectual research angle and the practitioner angle in ways that bring those together to make a bigger difference. So very, very pleased. And I think we need more of this kind of thing. Just some initial responses. I think it's shown up some really interesting and challenging issues about the 40%, 50% who we don't know enough about. I think the first point that the research really highlights is how varied that group is. It's not a homogeneous group, it's a heterogeneous group. I think particularly the recognition about some high achieving learners who just don't have their English or their maths, and actually what's the big difference between them and some of the others. I think also the really interesting challenge around SEN, for example, which I think is under analysed and not well understood. I would also add a couple of observations from our own college. And we're a college that I think we come out in the research as lower attainers in Oldham have probably less choice than they do some other places. And And in some respects, it's true that learners that come to us probably don't feel like it is a choice in many respects, because the choice is determined so much by your grades at GCSE. I don't think we're alone in that. And I don't think it means they have a poor experience all the time when they come to us at all either. In fact, we would say that something like 41% of our level 3 learners started with us at level 1. And I think 27% of those started at level 1 despite having a reasonably decent set of GCSEs. So there are some challenges in there for us to think about, well, are they starting in the right place? But here's the really important stat, is that when we compare learners who come in with high GCSE grades with those that come in with lower GCSE grades at level 3, there is no difference in terms of their achievement and attainment. So it does say quite a lot, I think. Certainly we are a vocational college, so we're not talking about A-level performance there at all, but certainly it suggests that there's a kind of over weighting given to the GCSE results in terms of later achievement. I think one of the really interesting things that comes out for us around this is this issue about the rush and the pressure cooker in which young people are making decisions about their future. Lots of the young people in research talks about the whole of year 11, but I think there's an even worse bit for those who don't get the grades they expected, because they're talking about literally making a life-changing decision within a week. You know, suddenly they thought they were going one direction, now they're going another direction. And I certainly know that many of the young people in the research didn't want to talk about their GCSEs because the experience had been traumatic. They're left with a sense of being damaged by the experience, really. And I think that's quite important. It's important in terms of what we do with them, but it's important in terms of thinking, well, you know, should it be that big a deal? Because some of the other evidence suggests it's not. And I would just emphasize, this is a rush for them and for us. We know very little about them. I think Catherine's made this point in terms of transition when they come to us, and we're making rapid decisions too, and we're clearly getting some of those decisions wrong. And perhaps there's a need here to think about how we extend the time we have to assess them, rethink about their starting point. There is clearly an issue about what comes to us in the first place, and I think Catherine made some really good points about transition. But that whole process there, I think, needs really looking at much more closely, because it's evident that young people are starting in the wrong place, and that cannot be the right thing for them or for us. I think that what we do about it is complicated, though. I just want to throw some ruminations on this, really, about how we get to the bottom of this, because I do think that it does highlight this issue that the GCSE results become overly important. I do think that in terms of post-16 reforms, some of the things that we're now dealing with should help to alleviate some of that, in the sense that we're trying to give more robust options, trying to be able to give people a real sense of actually you can make great progress to high-skilled occupations by having a better set of choices. But this research is showing us you can't get away from that critical point at 16. And when you come back to that point, the trouble is all the reforms that we're doing at post-16 may well get undermined by the fact that the real deciding factor in whether you choose a technical or an academic option, or choose to extend your general education post-16, is not whether you're choosing something that meets your wants, desires and talents. It's a relatively slightly arbitrary sorting system, which I think was Hewitt's point, that just says, look, you lot go in this group, you go in this group, and that's it, that's you're sorted out. And that's the point about it not really being a choice. So it begs the question of how we recalibrate this system so that actually it's not based on a slightly peculiar system of kind of almost sorting by cognitive ability, but it's not quite an accurate measure, so it's not really even very accurate at that, to something that actually starts to match people to their talents. And that's a much more complicated question. It does raise the question about more delivery pre-16. It raises the question about, you know, there are some of the things in the white paper will help with that, careers advice and so on, but it's not enough. It isn't just careers advice, because this is about planning your life. It isn't just about choosing a career. It's about thinking, well, what do I do if plan A doesn't work? Have I got a plan B? Have I thought that through? Can we take the heat out of that period at 16 if life kind of throws up some challenges for you? And understanding those. But importantly, this shouldn't just be about those choices for the lowest attainers. It should be about everybody understanding that differently, because otherwise what we end up is we're reinforcing the notion that lower attainers, well, we spot you early in school, we need to make special provision for you because actually you're going in the lower attaining option. What we want is actually a different notion of what attainment is and a different system of supporting people to get into the right choices. And that has to be universal for me, not just about particular groups that you pick out at year 9 or year 10 or later. Otherwise, it does reinforce the notion that actually colleges like mine are a sink option, but it's where you go if you haven't really got a choice. How we get there, though, does worry me simply because of the volume of change that we have to deal with. We're already dealing with a lot. D levels are huge, apprenticeship reforms significant, level 4 and level 5 is massive. However, we do have to then add on to all of that. We've got a really serious challenge to deal with how we deal with this post-16 transition in a different way, because we can do all the first few things, the things that are in the white paper, but this could wipe the carpet from under our feet if we're not attentive to it. I don't offer any easy solutions to that, but what I can tell you is that we will be looking very carefully at our processes to see what we can do within the constraints we've got. But I suspect we're going to have some further debates and discussions about policy to deal with the problem properly. I'll end on that note.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm now finally, I'd like to welcome Lawrence Morton from the Technical Education and Qualifications Reform Group Division at the Department for Education. So Lawrence is policy lead on level 2 and below study there. So he's going to give us a bit of the DFE perspective.
Great, thank you, Cheryl. I'm going to start by saying what everyone else is saying, which is congratulating Nuffield Foundation for this excellent report and very much needed research, which will be very valuable to us as well as everyone else in the sector. We're very fortunate to be able to follow the report as it developed, and it's great to see the final product. There's some really important issues highlighted in the report. The report tells us about low attaining students, or not real roots, as Ewart put it quite nicely earlier, and how they're not a homogenous group. And it's something that we hear from providers. They tell us about lumpy profiles of those students who have struggled with some subjects but actually do relatively well in others. And I think something that comes across here is that pathways for those students are not as clear as for those high performing students. And it's worrying that some students with good potential to go on to good destinations end up not achieving their potential. And I wonder if that's tied to some being perceived as failures, or is it down to the routes that they follow? And something that comes across strongly as well is that the local provision or area and the institution you go to seems to, in some parts, determine your prospects. I recognise that a lot of these issues fall to government and specifically to our department to address. I won't pretend we have all the answers to all these problems, but I do think that the recently published white paper titled Skills to Jobs, Lifelong Learning for Opportunity and Growth, which is a bit of a mouthful, it sets out an ambitious reform programme for further education. And I think it shows the priority that ministers have given to further education and to addressing some of these issues. In the white paper, there is a vision to transform the further education sector, so it supports people to get the skills they need to succeed in life and progress in their careers, wherever they come from and wherever they live in the country. I think some of these issues today, in particular, I'll focus on those in terms of the white paper and what white paper says about that. I think I'll start with talking about reforms to qualifications and study programmes. We have an ambition to create a world-class technical education system with employers at the heart, and we've already taken a number of steps to drive up the quality provision and to address the needs of low-attaining students. Of course, we have T-levels, which we're really delighted to see actually being delivered from this year. And these, of course, are the new level 3 technical programmes, which employers are heavily involved in. And we're introducing a transition to these T-levels, a transition programme for those who have potential to start a T-level, but who aren't ready after finishing their GCSEs to actually start immediately. And that will benefit many of the students this report talks about. And as part of the review of post-16 level 3 and below qualifications, which Kath mentioned earlier, we're also looking at whether there should be a broader transition programme for students who want to progress onto a level 3 programme that is not T-levels. And we're exploring how we can improve employment outcomes for those leaving education with level 2 and below qualifications. And I think Ruth said earlier that the white paper doesn't say a lot about low-level students. I think part of the reason for that is that we're still at a call for evidence stage on level 2 and below studies. So we're still wanting to gather evidence from the sector and views from stakeholders. And obviously this research will be really important in that. That call for evidence is open until the 14th of February. So I would encourage everyone to contribute if they can. And I talked about classroom-based qualifications, but of course the route for many will be through the workplace and learning in the workplace. And an important part of transition to work will be traineeships. And I think that will become increasingly important over the coming years. We've introduced a £1,000 payment to encourage employers to offer traineeships. And we aren't just trying to improve take-up, we have also reformed traineeships to enable a more flexible and tailored programme. Another thing that the report recognises is that it's not just about the courses on the shelf, but the choices that providers make about what to offer to students. And in the white paper, we set out that we want colleges to collaborate and to ensure there's a better match between demand for skills from employers and supply of skills from the FE system. And that's why in the white paper, we say we want to pilot new local skills improvement plans. These plans will include an assessment of the skills that employers need, allowing providers to understand what the demand is in their area. And of course, mayoral combined authorities will continue to have an important role in the local skills system and will consult those in the development of these plans. I think just to sum up, I could have talked about lots of other FE reforms, and there are lots of things you've touched on, like apprenticeships and information advice and guidance. But I think it's just fair to say that there is, of course, more to be done. And I'm interested to hear more from the panel today about what we could be doing and where we should be focusing our efforts. And just to promise that we will very carefully consider this report as we look at our reforms, in particular ones that I'm working on around level 2 and below study. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, and particularly for the reassurance on that. So we're now going to move on to the questions, answers and discussion. So I can see some people have put some answers in, some questions in, sorry. And I'm going to just start with some specific questions for the research team that are seeking a bit more clarification on things. So we've had a question from Sandra McNally about whether the research team found that young people starting out in low-level courses like level 0 or 1 progressed in some logical way through levels in the same type of course like construction, or whether there was a bit more jumping around, and whether they think that the young people starting out could foresee how they might progress through the levels, or was it more kind of a short-term thinking? And I think Sana has volunteered to answer that question, so I'll hand over to her now.
Yes, thanks, Cheryl. So this is something that I think we were able to get a bit of an idea of, mostly through the qualitative work that we did with young people. We weren't quite able to look at the detailed progression pathways in the administrative data, but surely when we talked to the young people, many of them didn't really have a very clear idea of where they were heading, or this sort of long-term view, which I think goes back to what has been said by many people on the panel about the kind of careers advice and the kind of pressured and hectic environment in which young people have to make decisions. It's only when they get to college and they're on a course that they start to think sometimes like, okay, right, what do I do after this? And they do find that they can seek advice at college usually about the further options out there. But a lot of young people also may change their mind. We did speak to some young people who changed from construction to sports or other things. So this does sometimes, there is some chopping and changing that happens there. And maybe that's a good thing to some degree if it helps people eventually get onto the right path. And there was also a small minority of young people who did have a clear vision of what they wanted to do. Even as far back as year 10 or year 11, they told us, look, I knew that I wanted to go into the fire service. I knew that I wanted to go into automotive. And for them, it was more just finding, like, where can I do that? Will I be able to get onto the course? And for some young people, that did prove to be a little bit difficult, but luckily for most of the young people we spoke to, they were eventually able to sort of get there. Although for some young people, it might not, their first choice might not have been possible, and there we sort of have these issues of blockages and things like that. So yeah, it was a bit of a mixed picture, but certainly a lot of young people who don't have really a clear idea is the impression that we got.
Thanks very much. And now a question from Ruth, which is from Tammy Campbell, who's asking about your recommendation that maths and English GCSE are only specified as a requirement when necessary. Beyond 19 and into 18 jobs. For example, currently somebody wishing to train as a secondary English or history teacher must have maths. Does this and the other gatekeeping by maths requirements make sense?
Hi, Tammy. I'm not qualified to answer that question, neither on the basis of this research or any other research I've done. I mean, maybe some of our other panelists are, but I think the general thing that comes out of our research is that employers often pick up the signals that are being given on qualifications in the education system, and they adapt those. And it'd be interesting to see now to what extent grade 5 in English and maths is becoming de facto the cut-off point for apprenticeships, and our understanding was that that isn't necessarily that employers are thinking through that. Does the person really need maths and do they need it at GCSE to higher grade to go on to my apprenticeship? But it's sort of adopted as the standard in the system, and I imagine that that is also the case you know beyond 19, but I don't really know. But I think the general message is look at what's actually really needed for the job.
I think Lorna might want to add to that.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think that the point that we would want to make is there's confusion about using maths and/or English, but particularly maths, as an entry qualification. So, you know, it's to what extent is it blocking access to an apprenticeship when actually when you look at apprenticeship standards, a lot of them will say, you know, the young person, whatever it is, hairdressing, construction, whatever, needs to work towards getting the level 2 in and won't necessarily specify GCSE. It can be functional skills, whatever. So our concern is that some apprenticeship opportunities are inaccessible because they make the maths an entry requirement. So it might be that, you know, that it's important for young people to carry on developing their maths, but they can do that whilst they're on the programme. So don't make it, you know, a question of access. And of course, it also then goes back to points I think some of the panelists made earlier, and I think Andrew made, which is the way in which, you know, maths are taught needs a lot of creativity. We can be a lot more creative, and certainly in the vocational route, you know, there's lots of really good practice, as Kathy said, to build on. So the point, I think, is don't make it, don't let it impede access to programmes where we know a lot of young people will find their feet and then they take off in terms of their achievement.
Thanks very much, Lorna. We've had a couple of questions in that are around the kind of transition. So views around school and college transitions and how this could be better supported, and thinking about maybe whether there's more school or kind of early intervention strategies for the lower attainment group and kind of how to support them through. Plus, more broadly, if there's any young people, well, for young people, what support there is to avoid them being not in education, employment or training. So I'd like to kind of go through and ask most of the panel for their views on that. So Ewick, could I come to you first?
Okay, yes. Yeah, support for those who are likely to become NEET. Well, it's my centre's done some research on this, and the general finding, I think, would be that in England, the support is very patchy. It's less, particularly once people have become NEET, the ability to re-engage people is more limited in England than it would be in, say, Scotland or Wales, where there's more infrastructure and more support and more focus on NEETs. I think the other thing to bear in mind is that essentially, as several participants have already said, if you're a school and your main concern, you know, at 16 is to sort people into your sixth form, and they're valuable to you because they're going to carry on being a student and therefore attracting money, and you sort out the students who, you know, effectively you're much less keen to retain. And so exams at 16 are like exams, you know, like the old 11 plus. It's a highly selective upper secondary phase, and I think that is a real problem, that we actually ignore the selectivity and the effects it has, and the labelling effect for those who don't retain, who are not retained in the school system, and particularly those who don't do particularly well at GCSE, is to make them into failures. And I don't think that's a very wise way of proceeding, because a lot of people struggle to get out from under the label they've been given.
Thank you very much. And Alan, from kind of the perspective of the college, is there anything you'd like to add about that, or kind of more broadly the transition? I know you mentioned a little bit in your initial comments. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Thank you.
Lawrence is particularly interested in that as well, I know.
I think we've done quite a bit of work in our college around transition, particularly around the most vulnerable. And it's certainly the case that the earlier we get to work with them and the earlier they come into college, the better they're likely to settle. So we have a programme. We can't run it currently for obvious reasons, but usually in the summer, we would bring them into college while college is shut, and we'd work with them. They'd get to know the staff, particularly the staff that they would see around the sites. They would go and do some outdoor activities with them, so that when they arrive in the summer, in the September, they know people already, and it's built relationships, and that was all very helpful. But I mean, this research is begging a whole set of wider questions about how much we know about the young people who come to the college in September on a much broader scale. And I just wonder whether the whole question about careers advice in school really needs to be broadened out to, you know, what's their plan? What are their interests? What do they like to do? Why have they chosen particular options? What's their plan B? So that they're prepared for the fact that, you know, unless we're going to throw the whole of the school system up in the air and do something completely radically different, maybe we need to prepare them to deal with that transition differently. And that means we need more about them at an earlier stage, but they need a lot more about what their real choices are. And that isn't just careers advice as traditionally defined. You know, they need to know about, you know, the different career options they've got, but the value of the qualifications. They need to know more about the different routes and opportunities they've got. You know, why is everybody obsessed with getting everywhere by the time they're 21? You know, you can go and do a degree at 30 if you want to. Go and do a vocational qualification, go and travel the world, earn some money. There's lots of different ways of living your life, and allowing them that to think about it in a different way. And I think then that might help us make better decisions about where they start as well. If they came with a document that kind of gave us more than just their GCSE results, which is what they turn up with, usually the day that they've got them, and they're usually in shock.
Thank you very much. I think Ruth has something to add to the point about those not in education, employment, training.
Yes, just a very quick response to Moira's question about the level of support not to become not neat. Very variable in the localities we looked at. And I would say a victim of local authority funding cuts in some cases, and also of the fragmentation of rapid fragmentation of the school system, and the impact of that on local authority resources. But there are some interesting things going on. Local authorities developing RAG rating systems to identify people who are at risk on further down the school system and so on. So some interesting things, but it's very variable.
Thank you very much. We've also had a question from David James, which is talking about whether we need to offer more alternatives to GCSE, which I wonder, Andy, would you like to pick that up, given your comments previously about maths?
Yeah, sure, thanks. This is a hot topic, obviously, and a couple of years ago, a group of us working at the Royal Society started to look at this, because at that time, you might remember, the Labour in opposition was saying, if we got into power, we're going to scrap the GCSE, and there's a lot of opposition to it, and everyone had a different plan. The challenge is what you do instead. 15 years ago, I remember the emergence of functional skills, which happened because employers weren't happy with GCSE. They know, as is still the case, that if I have 4 different people with a grade 4 at GCSE, it might be they got completely different sets of marks on that GCSE. I don't really know anything about their skill set. I wanted something that was a bit more competence-based, and functional skills originally was going to do that. Unfortunately, it's drifted ever closer to something like a GCSE, and so now ceases to fulfill that purpose. So I think what mathematics you have, and what sort of the balance between its use value and its exchange values is key. And in that project, the Pathways Evaluation Project, there was a GCSE use of maths, which was really popular and well received by the colleges. It was modular, it had things that were about finance and working with data and kind of things that all of those vocational students could see how it was relevant in their vocational course. In fact, they could take their coursework and do it in the maths course. And so that sort of interlinking, making a program useful for what you're doing rather than something standalone that's a remnant of a university A-level, O-level, sheep and goats, kind of got that legacy to it would be a good thing. Making it happen is very difficult. MEI have recently put together a proposal for this, supported by the Nuffield Foundation, and it falls over on well, various things that we probably haven't got time to go into now. So absolutely, we should be doing something different. What the answer is, and whether it ends up being better, is a moot point.
Thanks, Andy. And of course, there's been quite a lot of goes or reinventions of the wheel already. So to making sure the next one deals with the problems properly is important. I'd like now to go to Stephanie Thompson, who's a member of the research team, who's also going to come in on this question.
Thanks, Cheryl. Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of what Andy's just said, and also that one of the things that was striking for us really was actually even thinking about pre and post 16 in this system as having different curricula is problematic, and how we reimagine that is tricky. But I think the links between the two phases have to be better, and that I would pick up on another question that came up in the Q&A about, is the post 16 curriculum too narrow? I think for us, what we saw was that they're badly linked at the moment. And for some learners who progress in A levels, they do see clear links between what they studied before. But for others, the opportunity to carry on with some of the things that they might have done is effectively blocked off by a lack of maths or English at a high enough level. But also there are opportunities to think about linking backwards to vocational courses earlier as well. And that doesn't mean that that's an easy thing to achieve, but I think there has to be a lot more coordination between the two phases, and actually even setting them up as having different curricula could be a problem in how we think about it.
Thanks very much. And I think I was just going to come to Catherine next, because I think in your response you were initially talking about that kind of working across. But is there anything else you'd like to add on that?
Yeah, I just think that linkage, looking at young people's destinations, going back to I think what Alan was saying about having a plan. So students with education, health and care plans, you get a plethora of information about their plans, their destinations, the things they enjoy, what motivates them. So why we don't have more of that for all young people? And again, I go back to what Alan was saying about all young people. So it is the opportunity for all young people to consider technical options, for example, post-16, and the opportunity to open up conversations between schools and colleges. And that can be really, really tricky in some areas. But also, I think we have to bear in mind that young people look to their school teachers. And I came from a very academic background. I went to school, I then did actually go to college, I went to university, and then I went into teaching. And then when I was in my early 30s, I went to work in a further education college, and it was unbelievable. My goodness, you could train to work on a farm, you could do catering, you could do hair and beauty, you could do all these amazing things, and I'd got absolutely no idea. So I think it's how we can work better together, sharing of information, advice and guidance, not just with young people, but also their key influencers, parents, carers, school staff. I think, what are those exciting opportunities that are out there? And how do we present them to young people in a way that's really accessible to them? I think that's also important. What motivates them? Because if you're motivated, I always remember on one of our young apprenticeship courses, we had a young person, and I didn't often get letters from parents or carers, but I did, and I pinned this one up because I didn't get them very often, saying how this parent's son, having done the young apprenticeship in engineering, suddenly saw the reason why maths was important and was sailing now. So had gone from a student who wasn't going to achieve a good grade at GCSE to one who was really motivated and was going to achieve, because he could see the relevance. And I think you know, we have to go back to young people. A lot of policy at the moment is driven by employers, and it's right that we're getting young people in those right pathways to employment, but we also have to look at it from the perspective of the young person. So I think there are lots of opportunities. For me, the exciting focus of this morning is that we're actually talking about those students who perhaps don't always get the spotlight. I think that's really important.
Thanks very much, Catherine. And Lawrence, I'd like to go to you now for your point of view from the Department for Education.
Yeah, I think just in terms of transition, I mean, I think I mentioned this earlier, but we're particularly interested in the transition once someone gets to college. And I think something we're looking at is whether we can improve that progression up to the higher levels. And I think it's interesting that data shows that actually most of the students who sort of just miss out on those grade 4 English maths do actually get on to level 3 and achieve, but we want to increase the numbers doing that even further. And I think we're looking at whether you can have programs which are not just qualification based, but actually have kind of wraparound support, which look at the barriers that students face, and not just getting them to complete a qualification at level 2, but also what things are you lacking to get to level 3. And obviously the diagnostic stage and the information advice and guidance is quite important in that. But yeah, I think we're interested in kind of views on what are the things that we should be doing to help people address those barriers, and what kind of program might we need, but also at the lower levels as well, what more can we do to support progression and make the pathways a lot clearer. So yeah, I think lots and lots of ideas today, and we're really interested in hearing views on how best to do this.
Thanks very much, Lawrence. We are coming to the end now, so I was just going to ask one more kind of question, really particularly based on Liz Atkins has asked a question about what sorts of changes that the panel envisage are really required to make sure the offer is there for low attainers, and I would add to that to make sure that the support is there for the FE and wider sector to deliver those. So I'd like to go round the research team and panel for that. Ruth, can I come to you first, or what your kind of takeaway priorities should be?
I think we left this quite open, and I'd love to see the DFE consulting on this. We've had loads of ideas from the panelists about what's necessary. And if I could just refer back to, there was an earlier question, I think, from Lisa Russell about the pupil premium. It is bizarre that we don't have we don't see the need for extra funding for disadvantage in the post-16 phase. But I'm not sure that the answer is a pupil premium, at least if it's conceived in the way of the current under 16 pupil premium, which is quite narrowly focused on academic achievement and what schools can do. I think the support needs are broader than that, and also I think it's important to notice that in our research that lower attainers are across the, they're in every part of the country, across the whole range of the income distribution. So we've got issues about attainment and disadvantage in parallel here. So I think it's a complicated question, and it needs a lot more thought and consultation with people on the ground.
Thank you. Could I come to Andy next?
Yeah, just thinking about how to answer this, I'm reflecting on an earlier bit of the discussion, and my doctoral work was on primary to secondary school transfer and the problems of that, and the three main areas of priority: curriculum continuity, liaison, and data transfer. And we've heard the same things here. So in this context, the curriculum continuity was really discontinuous for these learners at that point. And having taught those students in year 10 and 11, tried to teach students in year 10 and 11, understanding that discontinuity is really key. And I think you have to go back to the recommendations of the report and think this isn't a post-16 problem, this is a 14 to 19 problem. This is what we've been this is what we've been going around for a long time. And then the other thing that I remember from that work, and it applies here as well, is about data transfer. Remembering that what gets transferred is, and Alan talked about this, is the kind of outcomes from GCSE. What you really want to know is all the assets of you want to know the students' interests, what are their aspirations, what they care about, what are they good at, and how we communicate that is really difficult, especially when you've got a kind of many-to-many interface between schools and post-16 settings. And then the final point goes back to Catherine's argument about careers advice and our own experiences as teachers, it's often never been anything like a vocational space. So how do teachers of those people get a handle on what those opportunities are? I hate to load it on teachers, a whole set of responsibilities about being careers advisors, because we'd like to load lots of things on teachers. But I think it is important for people to have a growing sense of what everybody else gets to do, which is not the experience of those of us that go through a system and become a teacher. So yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go to you next. I'm going to say we've only got a few minutes left, so
right. I'll be very quick. Yeah, my suggestion would be we develop a learning, careers and transition support service for all young people that kicks in at 14, and it helps them through the different phases of their education up to 19, and it also helps them to get their way into stable employment. If we did that, we'd make a massive step forwards.
Thank you. Catherine, have you got anything further to add?
So much to say, so I'll keep it to continue the research and spotlight on these young people, more collaboration, working together, and for me it's about these young people are where we can make the biggest impact, so more investment, and particularly when we're looking at the post-16 phase, more investment.
Thank you. And finally, Alan.
Sorry, just unmuting. The very immediate issue is to get them back into face-to-face learning. That's the most important thing we can do in the next few months, because this group in particular are really struggling with not being in meeting people and working face-to-face with tutors. The second thing is, I would just echo the points about improving transition. I think some really good ideas in there, but the focus must be on the wider young person's ambition and aspirations. And the wider challenge, which I think is more complicated and needs a lot more work and a lot more thinking, is shifting the system towards something that tries to match people to their talents. And it doesn't do that currently. It's kind of almost as if at 16, we've got a system that's really about getting the best people to university, because university is used by the professions as the gateway into those professions. And we've designed a system that meets the needs of a small minority. And it needs to be rethought in a way that actually meets the needs of the broader majority. That's complicated, which is why we all scratch our heads when we come to do it. But that's the thing that we need to get hold of in the longer term.
Thank you very much, Alan. I could see other members of the panel also nodding, and I think also bringing in your comment there about the urgent action to get back into face-to-face learning as well. That's a really important point to end on. Now, as we go into the final minute or so, I say thank you to everybody who's contributed today. It's been a really interesting discussion. I think we could probably have gone on for hours discussing all the issues. We've had a really varied audience today as well, from researchers, policy and people working assessment, and those that may be new to the area. And I'd just like to say thank you for everybody for taking part. We will be sending an email with the link to the webinar recording and the slides, so please do feel free to share that with colleagues. You can sign up to the Foundation's newsletter and visit our website, which includes information about upcoming events. One I'd particularly like to highlight is on the 24th of February from our Growing Up Under COVID project, which has been a participatory project which focuses on the lived experiences of young people during the pandemic and will involve hearing directly from young people who have been involved in the research. So sounds like a really exciting event to look forward to. We've also got details on the website about how to apply for a grant. So if this has sparked some research ideas, that tells you how to put them into us. And then to finally draw the webinar to close, I'd like to finish by thanking all of our speakers, to Ruth, to Stephanie, to Sanna, to Lorna from the research team, to Andy, Ewart, Catherine, Alan and Lawrence for your insightful and also thoughtful commentary and discussion. So thank you to you and everyone else for listening and taking part.